And it's lovely to have Pastor Ken Wytsma back with us. He was here earlier in the year preaching and teaching, and the feedback was really, really solid to Ken's ministry. And I thought, seeing as we're having him twice in 1 year, that it would be good to, rather than just get him to preach, to do a Q&A. And so I'm going to interview him this evening. Got some questions that he and I have worked out together, and a couple that I've worked in there that he doesn't know about. But he is a husband, a father to 4 children. He is also a pastor, a theologian, a teacher, and he is the pioneer of the Justice Conference internationally. And it's an absolute pleasure to have you back, Ken. Let's put our hands together and give him a warm welcome. We'll come a little bit closer, so it look like a long way away. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
It's good to see y'all.
Justice Conference is here in Melbourne this weekend. You've been speaking there, and Christy's been speaking there as well. She was introduced today as Pastor Christy Brinkley. I mean, in my opinion, she's always been a supermodel, but, you know, there you go. How's it been, the Justice Conference?
It was great. They made me go right after Christy, which wasn't good for me.
She's a hard act to follow.
Yeah, it's a hard act to follow.
Yeah, I know, I find that.
But it's beautiful. Beautiful venue down there, and to get that many people together that are listening to and thinking about giving their lives away, it's kind of a beautiful thing.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, you pioneered the Justice Conference internationally. How did it all come about?
So back in 2010, I was driving around a roundabout. You guys have those here. I saw as I was coming out, roundabouts, and feel like God said start a conference, call it the Justice Conference. That's really where it started. But the but the amazing part of it is there was a group of passionate people, like we saw in the video here, in our faith community that came together with all their different gifts and talents. So artists, videographers, poets, event planners, and basically in February 2011 had the first Justice Conference in Bend, Oregon.
So this is out of your church?
It's out of the church.
Awesome.
Yeah, and so we were expecting 500 people, 1,000 showed up, and the 800 of them were from outside of Central Oregon, and people that had been on 6 different planes from parts of Africa to make it to Bend, Oregon, and then we realized that was a bit onerous to bring them all the way to Central Oregon. So that's when we moved to Portland, and the rest kind of went from there. So now it's in Melbourne. It's going to be in New Zealand next week for the first time, and Holland in November, and then South Africa in March. So it's kind of an amazing thing to watch.
I love that. All out of God just whispering to you, start a Justice Conference. I had a similar experience in 1988 where God whispered to me, start a church in Cheltenham. And 4 years later, I did, and this is what it looks like now.
Yeah.
It's okay, huh?
It's amazing what faith can do over time, right?
Yeah, when God whispers and we agree with him. I've just been reading, I love to read. In fact, I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago called So Rob, What Books Do You Read? And a lot of people have read that blog, which is good. One of the books I recommended in that is a book I've just finished reading. It's called The Gifts of the Jews by Thomas Cahill, or Cahill. And have you read that particular
I haven't
book?
read that one, but I love Thomas Cahill.
Yeah, he's a brilliant author. The thing that struck me, or many things that struck me in that book, but one of the enduring themes all the way through was that every book in the Hebrew Scriptures, what we refer to as the Old Testament, has justice as its major theme. And I just love that. So it's a massive theme all the way through the Bible. Is that just something that has gripped your heart personally?
Yeah, I think I shared a bit of my story last time I was here, but my dad was an immigrant, and then when I was 8 years old-ish, we had a Cambodian refugee family that had fled the genocide there under Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, and came and lived in our house. And so it took a little while. My sister had caught a lot sooner. She went and got a law degree and started doing pro bono work with asylum seekers, and still is an award-winning lawyer in L.A. doing that. It took me about a decade to kind of come around and kind of wake back up to some of those things I think God had woken in my heart sooner. But the justice, when you kind of experience injustice or you experience inequality, and then you begin to read the scriptures, it's really hard to miss. I think sometimes we, in the position of privilege, often kind of navigate around it and find ways not to see it. And we also camp in the New Testament, and then the English Bible, we use different words to kind of parse out different parts of the story. And so the word justice or judgment is kind of this spiritual reality, whereas in the Old Testament, it was very much, what are you doing to your neighbor, for your neighbor, not for your neighbor? How are the scales unequal within the legal system of that country or whatever country? Are you welcoming the refugees? So I think there's just some strange things that have happened so that we can be in Scripture and blind to the fact that justice is a thread that runs all the way through.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think the Bible actually means by the word justice? How would you summarize that?
Yeah, so defining the word justice would be simply a right relationship with God, self, others, creation, or when things are as they ought to be. So when God is demanding justice, he's saying, I've told you how it should be, so how come it isn't like that? When he's speaking to injustice, he's pointing to specific things that are broken or wrong that shouldn't be that way. But justice is either pointing to a break in what ought to be or the movement toward restoring things to the place they ought to be.
So what would be the best way for us individually as well as corporately as a church to make sure that things are as they should be? How can we work for justice?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem in the church, English-speaking church worldwide, is that we've created a false dichotomy where we can enjoy the good news, the gospel, and have that be separate from our politics, separate from the plight of others. That those are two separate realities, right? And I think it's because we have a thin reading of the gospel that says the cross saves me. We don't even say Jesus. We just take the cross as shorthand, right? And frankly, the cross, God could have used a stone table like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? The cross wasn't a necessary component. It's the plate to the meal. It's highly symbolic now that was where Jesus died. But God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ Jesus and has now given us the ministry of reconciliation. So cross saves us, makes us consumers of grace. Isn't this a wonderful story for me? When we tell the gospel, and I think a better way, by saying God is reconciling the world through Jesus Christ, the object God, what is he doing reconciling, and what's the direct object? The world, not just me, but the world. And it's not just about a transaction, it's about restoration and justice. And when we tell the gospel story in an accurate way, it's not that the other sentence isn't true, it's just we're too zoomed in, and it doesn't provide a meta-narrative that we can sit under and actually live under. And so when we take that gospel as consumers, we don't really engage the world. When we take grace the other way, not only do we consume grace, but we also become agents of grace, agents of reconciliation. And now the complexity of what's going on around us actually requires something of us because God, through Christ, with us, is doing something for the world.
Yep, so it's faith and works. And I love that you've touched on I think I look at the Western church particularly, and certainly it's this way in Australia, that consumer Christianity has kind of gripped our churches these days, which
Absolutely.
is, I'm sure, the same in the United States. And
No.
No, it's completely different over there. I thought it might be. Yeah.
Yeah, I almost told a joke at the Justice Conference. I was going to start my talk with a joke about Australians, so I was looking it up, but they were all too harsh online. And then I thought, you all must be an insecure people that can't take teasing. So I left it off. I'm just kidding. Sorry.
That's okay.
I guess that was...
Isn't that wonderful? He deserved that, right?
Yeah. Sounds... I won't say that one again.
Consumer Christianity.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So people are... it's all about me and Jesus rather than looking at me and Jesus and how we can make things better for other people, right?
Yeah, so John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, it's a crazy thing. The guy that writes the song about heaps of grace that come to an undeserving person and how amazing it is, didn't see it as him being at the end of kind of a conveyor belt where grace is just coming down to him to consume. But if you look at his life, he saw grace as something much more like a fireman's brigade. That carries across, right? In Australia, fireman's brigade, bucket of water, and you're passing it down the line, in the olden days, fireman's brigade. Grace is something that comes to us and then goes from us. Grace begets grace. And I think in John Newton's life, this amazing grace he was singing about was a transformative grace that then manifests in the world. We love because Christ first loved us. And I think when we sing that song, or we betray ourselves when we sing that song, and we're just seeing ourselves as kind of the ending point. And if grace is a beautiful thing, if it's a regenerative thing, then it brings life from it. It doesn't just terminate with us at like the end of a train station.
Let's move to some specifics on this particular area, because it's very easy to talk in generalities and go, how does this actually apply? Think of one or two areas that we here in Australia can apply this practical justice to. How can we carry grace?
Yeah, I don't know that it's much different than the States these days. I think immigration worldwide is a challenging topic because it pushes into our vision for our best life. And the idea that we might be inconvenienced and we can find political excuses to justify faith on one hand, but not trying to make room for the other or to fight for children or whatever it might be. So in the States, it's a really difficult thing. I think when we objectify people, so whenever someone starts with the phrase, well, they, I just stop them right away. They, the Mexicans, they, the African Americans, they, the liberals, and I kind of, well, who's they? Like you can't take a whole mass of people and turn it into one kind of simplified reality. Overgeneralize it. And so I think there's a lot of triggers that we have where we can stop ourselves and say, I'm not living justly if I'm thinking in those ways.
Yeah. So we can look at situations here in Australia and bring grace to different peoples. It's certainly something that we try and do as a church community on a regular basis. You've just touched on things in America at the moment, and Mexicans and other words that we've been hearing a little bit about. We get a lot of coverage in Australia on the American elections. I think many of us kind of look at it and go, why does it take so long? Because you had the primaries last year and this year, and now the presidential race. It's over a year, isn't it? And then just in case people get bored of politics, of not having any politics, in 2 years you'll have the midterms. Yeah. And then the whole process starts again. Yeah. Do you ever get tired of it in the States?
Absolutely.
Oh, so glad.
Absolutely. God called me to be a pastor. That's my excuse for, I'm not a politician. Politics matter because the city matter. I mean, the word politics just comes from the Greek word polis, city. So it's the affairs of a city. So politics matters, right? Because cities matter because that's where people are. But I'm glad that I get to spend my day loving on people, not trying to come up with the legislation or hammer it through the broken systems to fix it. I get to say that immigrants matter, because they do. Yeah. I get to say that the stranger or the refugee is someone I want to welcome and love because that's from a spiritual standpoint, that's obvious. I'm lucky because I think the politicians have a harder job actually trying to figure out how to enact legislation that's just and equitable and fair. For everybody.
Yeah. And no, I don't envy their job either.
Did I escape the elections, or am I just postponing it?
I'm going to steer you right back onto that again, because I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I just want to ask you, because, I've sort of been looking at it, and I think just kind of talking to a lot of my American friends as well, they actually don't know who to vote for. Sure. They feel out of, 300 plus million people, that this is the two that they actually have a choice of. And as I heard someone say yesterday, you've got Hillary and her emails and Donald and his females. And so it was a very clever statement.
Very clever,
What do you make of all of this? And what do you think the outcome and fallout will be for America? Because this is really important, isn't it?
It is.
For the world's biggest power.
It is. And I think the one thing that needs to be said is we've all been pulled into a reality TV show and didn't realize it. All of us. I mean, you all watch the debates more than I do. And so we've all been sucked into some reality TV show. But to understand the American system, you have to realize it's a two-party, very, very kind of bifurcated two-party system. And so you have just those two realities, no third party, no viable anything else. And so people have grown up over a long period of time having a value set that pushes them more to one party or the other party. And it's been getting worse, and you have to understand, you don't have to understand anything. I think it helps if we understand what confirmation bias is. And confirmation bias is when I have an opinion, and then it gets mirrored back to me by people that have the same kind of convictions, but I treat it as if it confirms kind of the original thought, you know. Just because others are mirroring back to me doesn't mean that somehow my opinion's been grounded. Does that make sense? That's confirmation bias. Facebook is one big mechanism for producing confirmation bias. Every time you hit like, Facebook learns that that's something you like, so it shows you more of that, which means you're gonna like more of that. And little by little by little, Facebook shows you more and more of your most extreme self. And so if you're already on one end or the other, and every day you're looking at that wall, little by little, you think you're hearing a lot of voices, so you have an informed opinion. What you're really hearing is all the people that think like you. And that's what's happening more and more in the States, where you're seeing everybody move to the most extreme version of themselves. Now, on the right, the one thing that makes it make sense is that people are voting the Supreme Court. You've heard the evangelical thing for Trump and all that. In America, the supreme authority is not Congress, it's not the president, it's the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court puts something down, and that's the end of discussion. And so America has for 20, 30 years been in a pretty much a deadlock at the Supreme Court level. And so for a country that thinks, where a lot of people think of themselves as a Christian nation or having Christian values, that's hanging in the balance. And so the people that are willing to overlook what's happening with Trump, their justification for doing that is a fear of what's going to happen when the swing vote all of a sudden becomes a liberal judge sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court. On the other side, the Democratic side, a lot of my good friends are appalled that evangelicals can miss so much of the racism and the misogyny that goes on. And it took Donald Trump talking about groping, and this is, by the way, I talked about this in my church. Some of these things are actually church talk. Like, we need to have real conversations, right? But it took Donald Trump talking that way about white women for white power women and white power men in America to all of a sudden cry out. It wasn't when he said that all Mexicans are rapists. It wasn't when he said, I'm going to help African Americans get jobs, and the interviewer said, how? And he said, well, it's hard because they all have tattoos on their faces and dreadlocks. They all, right? And so the tension, I think, that happens is that thin gospel, cross saves me, that if you only give a thin gospel for decades after decades after decades, then you get to an election like this, you can see Christians not having the maturity to think through some of those topics. And so I tried to teach my church that faith in politics does not mean that you simply vote your values. Faith in politics means that whatever happens as a result of that election, that God is still sovereign. That I still look to Him with faith, even if I'm confused, even if I'm a bit scared, and I walk by that faith with my hope in Him, not my hope in the system, you see? And so faith in politics, I have to be willing to look at my kids and say, your dad had enough faith not to vote for an individual who was amoral, because I didn't want to compromise my standards or my convictions.
Amoral or immoral?
Both? No, I'm just kidding. I think the challenge here is, in the 80s, you had the moral majority, and then in the States, we kind of went by the Christian coalition, and then the bigger phrase is the religious right. And I guess what I'm really trying to say is there's a candidate that has stripped the first part of all those phrases and just left us with the right. And I just don't... Personal conviction is it's hard for me to say I want to go to the grave with I voted for Donald Trump on my tombstone. And frankly, You're right. Most Americans would say there's 100 million Americans that would be better qualified than either of the two candidates we have. But there's a difference between the behavior of one and the political realities of the other. You know, so.
I love your answer there, and a particular statement that you made, I think, is absolute gold for us in Australia as well, because I think we still get a little polarised in Australia, but not to the degree that the American church does, but realising that whoever gets in, God is still on the throne.
Yeah.
And that one of the enduring themes of the New Testament is that whoever the leader is, we should pray for them.
Absolutely.
If Peter was able to write, honour the king, and he was talking about Nero, if you know your history, Nero was not the nicest guy on the planet.
Yeah.
So we should be able to pray for them no matter what our politics is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And as a side note, I'm a father of 4 daughters, and my wife is incredibly excited. It's the first time she's ever voted Democrat in her life.
Really?
But she's incredibly excited that she can tell our daughters, you can be anything God wants you to be, that there's no ceiling or no barrier to that. So to me, it's a little bit of a nice silver lining on what is otherwise a difficult situation.
It'll be interesting watching over the next 3 weeks as the reality program continues.
It continues.
Yeah. Let's get back onto one of your favourite topics, justice.
Please.
In your writings, you talk about the theology of justice, theology of creativity. Why do you use the word theology? Because it so often has negative connotations.
Yeah, it's a very positive word for me, and I realize it's not for other people. I used to tell everyone, you know, my first book was supposed to be called Theology of Justice, and the publisher changed it on me, and I was just like the Australia joke. I'd always wait for people to agree with me, and they never would. And I realized that theology is just a word that doesn't go over well. But what I mean by that is simply we can come at a topic directly, justice, creativity, marriage even. Or we start by taking account of God, understanding what his purpose in creation is, and then kind of arcing down. So the book of Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. What that means is the fear of the Lord, that taking God first, thinking of God first, understanding God first, and then looking at everything else through that lens. That's the beginning of knowledge or wisdom, right? So theology of justice means I don't just start talking about criminal justice or whatever it might be. It's looking at God and saying, wow, my understanding of God should compel and drive my love of others. Okay, not only that, but as I love others, it informs my understanding of God. God's a father. He's somebody with a heart for his people. Creativity, we confuse that with art too quickly. And so that's kind of why I began to play with this theology of creativity. And it's the same idea, like what would I learn about creativity if I looked at God first, understood him as the creator, and then kind of branched into that topic. I've got more I'd like to say that, but...
Please do say more about that. I was just reading the next question, and it kind of dovetails into that. But broaden out our thinking of creativity, because it is more than art or singing or music, as much as we love those 3 things represented on the front row over there. Talk to us, those of us who are not artistic or musical.
Yeah, so playing with the theology of creativity, I went to Genesis 1:27, which is God created them. Male and female, he created them. In his image, he created them. And I pondered this a lot. And what emerged was that there's one word that shows up more than any other word in that verse, and it's the word created. That hallmark verse of God's creation or the idea of being made in God's image keeps speaking about this idea of creation and creativity. And so if you were on a desert island, you had only that verse, and someone asked you, what is it that makes up God? What is the stuff of God? What fills up God? Like, what is his image? What is that reflection, right? There's only one thing you could say from that verse with grammatical necessity, and that's that God's a creative being. So to be made in God's image means that we are fundamentally creative. And so I think we have some misnomers. Artistic ability is a talent or a skill that some people possess, but creativity is a human trait. Okay? Artistic ability is a skill or a talent that some people possess, but creativity is a human trait. So when you say, I don't have a creative bone in my body, you're actually saying something that's theologically incorrect. And I know what we mean by that. What you mean by that is I don't paint, or sing, or write poetry. And so we kind of compare ourselves to very good artists and then go, well, I'm not like that. And we miss the fact that we have an imagination, that we never delegate the naming of a pet, like we do it ourselves, like we make up our own weekend plans. If I say to you, imagine with me a bird, right? Two things I know are true. One, everyone in this room is able to do it. Two, no two mental images that you came up with are alike, right? We're fundamentally imaginative, creative beings. And the life of faith needs us to learn more about this creativity and imagination, because when you walk with your eyes closed, you kind of have to be able to imagine that God is in control, to apprehend what he's doing in your life or as you're moving forward. When you have your eyes open and you see there's no creativity involved, it's just that. It's that thing, right? And so I think it's this huge part, imagination in our pursuit of God that doesn't get spoken about enough.
So everyone listening to you right now is a creative being.
Yes.
It's very liberating, isn't it? You just think about the ways that you are creative and create in those ways. And then you don't have to look at other people that are artistic. I mean, there's Karen sitting on the front row. She sings and paints and does all of these very creative things. But we're all creative. Isn't that great? Even those of us who can't draw. My daughter Gigi, she laughs at my drawings because her art is so amazing. And I can't even do stick people in proportion. So.
The good news is that creativity is like a muscle. It can atrophy through disuse or grow through use. And so there's still hope for you.
You think I should take painting courses?
No, I think we need, as a church, to grow our vocabulary to see creativity in more places than we do. You're a vocal artist.
Yeah.
You're a public speaker, which is an art form. Those of you that work in reconciliation ministries, you take this person, and the relationship is broken, and you have to use so much creativity to say, how do I navigate this to bring them back? Those with the gift of hospitality, you make space for life, as a friend of mine, Vainant DeCock, would say, and allow for things to flourish. You create that. So I think our vocabulary can grow and enrich, and then it'll speak so much more to our spirituality.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
In your book, you talk about generous creativity. Is that what you're referring to there?
Yeah, so one of the realizations with creativity is that it has a lot to do with justice. If I can remember how I like to say it, the application, when the application of love meets complexity, it requires creativity. When the application of love meets complexity, it requires creativity. I used to think the most important thing I could do for my daughters was tell them I love them. And I used to do it 20 times a day. And I realized after a while, I would say it, they weren't really receiving it. And so something was required more than me just saying that I love them. They need to feel loved, right? And so what I began to realize is sometimes as kids go up and down in life, you can say you love them, but what they hear is that you're stuck with me and that you're okay with it, And they think that you don't like them. No, this is. I struggled with this growing up with my father, who's a wonderful man, and I've come to learn that in his Dutch way, I just wasn't reading it. But I felt loved, but not liked. Like if my dad had to choose someone to go hang with in the evening or go to a movie, that it wouldn't have been me. Now, I think that was wrong of me, but I projected that onto God too, right? So it's not just about saying we love people, like they have to somehow feel it. And so there's a complexity that you run into. So creativity is, how do you get around that and actually make it stick? So I tell my daughters now, hey, your dad loves you. Yeah, you know what else? What? I like you. And that only works, it's starting not to work with my oldest because she's on to me, but it's like, it's creativity. So switching again, when you want to welcome the stranger and you meet with, I don't know if I'm getting too political for the Australian context. No, you go for it. And I'm leaving, so you can kick me out afterwards. But I realize the complexity of it. When you want to love the stranger and you run into detention camps and the challenge of what it looks like for minors in certain places, like I get the impasse. That's where creativity is needed. You see how creativity comes into our understanding of justice, right? It even matters for ourselves. I have a gut that is destroyed. I don't have the energy I used to have, but I really want to like go out in the world and make a difference. And so then I have these kind of feelings of self-recrimination. And so I even need a bold Holy Spirit wind creativity to come into me and remind me that in this gospel story I kind of drew out for you, that the truth is when I am weak, then I am strong. That somehow there's a way, even with the challenges and the complexity, that God can use me in my weakness more than he used me in my strength. But the application of love, when it meets complexity, requires creativity.
Yeah, I love that, and thank you for your honesty as well. I know that you've had some pretty major health concerns and challenges over the years, and I love the fact that you've been able to re-look at your life and what that means. Even with less energy, I still think you do an amazing job.
Thank you.
Traveling around the world, teaching, preaching, running a church, family of 4, and so on. So, don't be too hard on yourself. Amen. Yeah.
I was going to give the credit to my wife, and you'd probably agree with me.
You're going to what, sorry?
I was going to give the credit to my wife,
Of
but
course.
you'd probably agree with me, yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, sweetheart. Yeah. On a different tack, we need to finish up in a few minutes, but as I mentioned before, I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago on the books I like to read, because I was finding that was one of the questions I would be asked quite a lot and by people. They want to know, well, what do you read as a pastor, and what do you read specifically? What do you find is helpful? And so I wrote that. So I'm going to ask you the same question. What do you like reading? Who's your favourite authors? And recommend a couple of books to us.
Sure. Yeah, so this is my least favorite question that I get as a pastor, because I don't have a very spiritual answer, but I'll give you an honest answer. I read a lot of history. So when you're talking about Thomas Cahill, I just finished a book by Thomas Cahill. When I was on sabbatical, I read 3,000 pages of Italian Renaissance history. I didn't plan to. I just started and didn't stop.
I do that by accident as well occasionally. I'm just like on my 3,000th page.
I had 3 months, and I went to Italy at the beginning of it, and it just went, right? But so I think that there's something beautiful about history, because I think as well-intentioned Christians, it gives us balance, it gives us wisdom, right? So I love getting the full context of things so that we can speak around it. So I read a lot of history. I also love and keep going back to C.S. Lewis. I think every time I've outgrown him, I end up reading a little something and find something magical there again. I got into the Russian novelists for a while, Dostoevsky, trying to learn what they could teach us about the human condition or the nature of the human heart. But there's a lot of other authors that I recommend. I just have never read their books, and I just kind of fib it with people. That's not the answer you're looking for.
It's not really, no.
I listen to...
I'm sitting, I'm thinking, I'm trying to put myself in the congregation's minds here, and one or two books that would really resonate strongly outside of the Renaissance and everything that would really be of value.
Yeah.
Other than the Bible, of course, because we all read that.
Yeah. So there's a guy in Melbourne named Mark Sayers who has some amazing books, and I think they're worth looking into. Eugene Cho, who's here for the Justice Conference, has a book called Overrated. I love that. Justice really should be less about being heroic than it should be about being faithful, right? I think that's worth reading. A good friend of mine, Leroy Barber in the States, wrote a book called Embrace. So from an African-American perspective, talking about what does it look like to really come together and find shalom, and really enjoyed reading that book and endorsing it. There's a book for the book nerds in the room. Christopher Smith, who wrote the book Slow Church, wrote a book recently called Reading for the Common Good. A fascinating look at the exercise of reading and having communities of readers and how that shapes our engagement with the common good or kind of society around us in our cities. Fascinating read. So yeah, there's lots of good books out there, and I'll think of more. So come find me afterwards. Happy to give you some recommendations.
That's fine. 2 or 3 is great. And of course, you can always read the blog that I wrote 2 weeks ago. Talking of questions, another question, and I'm told this is the question that Christians ask the most when it comes to their faith, and that is, how can I know God's will for my life? What would you say in answer to that?
Actually, in my second book, talked at length about that, the grand paradox, and challenged the question and say that the reason we have such a problem with that question is because it's flipped upside down. So we ask all the time, what is God's will for my life, and how can I know it? And once I feel like I've known it, how can I be encouraged again that I got it right and didn't get it wrong, or whatever it looks like? And I actually think what that does is it treats God as if God has 7 billion wills, one for every person, and that somehow they all have to harmonize, and it's this really crazy picture if you think about it. I think it's the question should be, what is God's will for the world, and how do I serve that with my life? So what is God's will, and how do I serve it? And it makes it God-centered. And now there's 7 billion people who can all harmonize as a body in some ways, or at least the church or the body of Christ, because we're all coming and steering into one unified purpose. Then the question becomes, and I think this is where it's more appropriate, how do I receive guidance as I go through and try to navigate serving God's will? And that's a lot easier to answer because it's a day-to-day gentle nudging of the Holy Spirit, or those, what my wife and I would call coincidences with a capital C, where you begin to see God's fingerprints and lining up. Timing is a big way the Holy Spirit works. I have a friend that says timing is God's signature on events. And so going after guidance turns out, I believe, is a lot more encouraging and helpful, because that's the way God tends to work and steer through things. But we keep our eyes fixed on the prize, and we know that we're serving His will with our life, as if God's whole will in that moment of 7 billion people is that I marry this girl, not that girl. Or His will is, and I think you get it. And so I flip it around.
Yeah, I love that. That was gold, what you just said. And if you came and got nothing else out of tonight, what you've just said, I reckon, is something that everyone can take with them. That thought is revolutionary, because I find it's constantly, how can I find God's will for my life? And what you've just said is very liberating. So how can I? Yeah. What is God's will for the world, and how can I dovetail with that? How can I embrace that?
Yeah, when we say what is God's will for my life, we forget that even if we knew it, we're going to screw it up, right? Like, I mean, there's this assumption as if we just had better information, somehow I'd become better at life, right? And even when I have good information, I screw it up. Ask my wife. And so the thing is when I get to serve God and it's about God's purposes, then I begin to be liberated that even my messy stuff, even when I get it wrong, I get to try and do it again. Ravi Zacharias, it's another author you should read, but he reads a poem of a teacher that talks about a student bringing up a paper all blotted and spoiled, and that the teacher gives them a new one and says, try again, my dear. And the poem shifts and talks about us with our days and bringing our day to God all blotted and spoiled and handing it to Him, and Him saying, here's another chance, my dear. And this idea that we were able to just continually serve God's will even as broken people that get it wrong so often.
Yeah, even in our mistakes. So His mercy is new every morning.
Every morning.
Ken, you've got 3 books here. Would you like to talk us through? Do you want to have a look at them just so you know what you've written? Or
they're all on Donald Trump. My first book was a book called Pursuing Justice, and it really is just trying to look at biblical justice in a practical way. And like a gem or a kaleidoscope or something, just turning it and kind of showing the different facets. How does empathy play into justice? How does grace play into justice, and those kinds of things? And a lot of the thinking behind the Justice Conference is kind of in that book. And then my second book, which is my wife's favorite, is this book on the life of faith, and just trying to understand faith not as a belief that God exists, but a trust that God can and does work in our life, and we can lean on that. So the life of faith, the grand paradox, subtitles, the messiness of life, the mystery of God, and the necessity of faith. That's where the stuff on the will of God is. And then my latest book is called Create versus Copy, and it's just a 20,000 word. That's actually not many. I realize it might sound like a lot, but 20,000 words, short little book really talking about human creativity. What does it mean as Christians, and how can this empower us in our families, as parents, with our career, as we look at the future? What can that practically look like? So it's a fun, short little book with really cool illustrations by an artist friend of mine. So
wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Creative artist. Yeah. I'm really grateful that you've come to visit us again, and you'll be back in the morning and we'll chat some more.